The last video I did on the concept of Normans versus Saxons, I also introduced the dichotomy between Thor and Odin, and in the comments I then developed that further into Zeus versus Heracles, or otherwise known as Hercules. But these two pairs could then be compared to Christ the Son, God the Father, and there's an interesting thing that happens here. So, when we talk about Odin, and I've said this before, Odin is esoteric. Odin is the originator of the runes, or he sort of receives the runes. He receives this esoteric knowledge, and then he shares it with the world. So, humanity now understands the runes because they received it from Odin. Odin is this prophet figure. He's like a medium, kind of similar to Prometheus, who takes fire, he steals fire from the gods and gives it to humanity. So he's a Promethean figure, and he's a medium between the world of the esoteric and the world of humanity, the exoteric, what we can see as humans versus this hidden knowledge, the hidden structure of the universe. And so that's symbolized by the runes. With Zeus, Zeus does not necessarily serve that exact mythological function. But he clearly is this exo or esoteric character. He is certainly someone who views sex not for its exoteric value, but for its esoteric value. And this is symbolized by his polymorphic personality. Zeus is always morphing into a swan to impregnate some woman in an act of bestiality, or he's having his way with Ganymede. He's having his way with young boys. And what's important to understand there is that we have an idea, a political idea in the 20th and 21st centuries, even as far back as the 19th century with the Uranian idea of the German sexologist in the 19th century. But we have an idea of what the homosexual is today, that the homosexual is sort of feminine, the homosexual is perhaps someone who is superficial, someone who is just we might have certain stereotypes that they're interested in fashion, and that they're interested in women's drama, or they're interested in being best friends with women, that they enjoy clubbing, and that they're hedonistic and very inward looking, and so on and so forth. So when we look at that kind of act, and also the pedophilic element that was certainly there in Greek culture, we look at that today and we say, okay, a pedophile is someone who is antisocial, a pedophile is someone who is weak, and therefore they seek after young children to make themselves feel powerful. And I'm not really disputing any of those stereotypes in the modern context. But when we talk about the mythology of Zeus, of course, having a wife, Hera, but then also, having all kinds of other sexual relations with men and women, we have to understand that in an esoteric meaning, because the exoteric meanings of sex are, it's an economic union, it's a political union, it's a biological union, so there are exoteric meanings to sex, but then there's also an esoteric transfer of power. And so whenever we have penetration, we're talking about one person assuming the active role and one person assuming the passive role. And now there's all kinds of ancient ideas in Tantra, for example, the idea of a transfer of energy during the sex act. So the idea there is that, like the succubus, that if you have sex with somebody, you are giving your energy to them. The man, when he releases his sperm, he's releasing his energy. The woman receives the energy, and with that transfer of energy, she's able to create a child. She takes the energy from the man, and that energy then produces the child. Now, if there is no child produced, then this is simply an empty transfer of energy, which is, perhaps why you have a biblical injunction against spilling your seed on the ground, because you're wasting your energy, right? Nietzsche talks about how the semen, if it is not expelled from the body, it's retained and it's transformed into blood. And so this then can be linked back to Tacitus, who talks about how the German warriors were more masculine because they practiced sexual celibacy and semen retention through their early 20s. And so it was basically, the stereotype was, if you were a young man and you had sex, or you were off having sex with women through your teenage years or whatever, you were a weak man. And the way to preserve your strength and create a strong man was to be sexually celibate until your early 20s, until you were fully developed. That the idea there is that your body is developing, it needs the energy to grow tall and strong and whatever. And so only once you're fully developed in your physical body can you then afford to waste that spermatic energy on the sex act. But there's then a reverse perspective that you find in Rome, where, especially when you talk about a conquering army forcing the conquered people to be the passive partner in a sex act, oral, anal, sex, we're then talking about a humiliating act. We're talking about a transfer of masculine energy from the conquered people to the conqueror. And so it's not done in the spirit of, oh, well, we Romans were such fairies, we're so effeminate, we're so female-like that we're going to engage with a sex act with men. It's actually the opposite. It's you're taking the conquered army and you're forcing them into a feminine role. And so it's actually viewed as a hyper-masculine trait in the Roman context and the Greco-Roman context. So for a man to have sex with a woman, exoterically, that's all harmonious, right? You've got the political element, the economic element, the biological element. Everything is there set up and harmonious from what we can see on the surface. But now, esoterically, when you're talking about the sex act, if, these Greek philosophers and the Greek mystery schools and everything, if they are cultivating these relationships with young men, what they're doing is they're hyper-masculinizing their sexuality. They're removing the feminine element from that, and they're creating an exclusively masculine space. Now, I'm not advocating this practically. I'm not advocating this for the present day. I'm simply trying to decode and understand the mythology as it was, the culture at that time, to explain a dynamic that's going on here. Where sex is symbolic. At the same time, within that culture, it was an active practice. There was a theory of sexuality, and there was active practice of sexuality. So I think it's worthwhile to understand this without then conflating that into some kind of, because people have done that, and they've said, well, if we really want to be like the ancient Greeks and Romans, we need to go back to pederasty. And there are people who will advocate that. And of course, that's what the NAMBLA people with Ginsburg back in the 60s, they were advocating. Same thing was going on in Germany from the extreme left. They were advocating totally opening up the sexual realm. But you have to understand that in the Greco-Roman context, they were not talking about sexual liberation. They were not saying that the relations between a man and a young boy are like drinking a glass of water, or it's just a natural habitual thing, or it's just a casual thing. The Greeks and the Romans were not advocating casual sex when they talked about pederasty or homosexual relations. They were talking about a sacred and powerful and dangerous transfer of power from one man to another man. And so in the context of a student-teacher relationship, when that, and again, we have to understand that when we're talking about power, we can talk about something that is, again, it's very difficult to describe this because you're operating with two moral languages here. And so there's kind of something gets lost in translation, and it does come out as the whole topic itself should be, the demonstration should already be evident that this is something which is obviously a powerful element. This is not something casual. This is not something insignificant. This is not something... The idea that heterosexual relations and homosexual relations are equivalent. They're the same love. It's just two people who love each other. Why do you care if it's the opposite gender or the same gender? Well, the Greeks and the Romans did care. They did think it was significant. They thought it was culturally significant, spiritually significant. They didn't view it as a casual thing. They viewed it as a very important transfer of power that actually, and I think this is true, that if you have a young man who is being sexually dominated by an older man, that is an exercise of autocracy, of tyranny, of absolute power. And, you could clearly say that's abusive in a modern context, because there's a total inequality of power. What the Greeks and the Romans, and especially the Greeks, they saw that was a power that a teacher or tutor, older man could have over a young man. And that power was part of how they formed their secret cults and secret societies, and how they formed an elite, and how they formed all of these things. And so when we talk about that, the context of something today like Pizzagate, where people, and again, it could be mythological. I can't tell you whether or not, I can't tell you the extent. I know there have been verified stories of, actual people working in Hollywood or entertainment more broadly, in the BBC and in San Francisco, people who have engaged in outright pedophilia. Like, not just like, men with teenage boys, but, for instance, Woody Allen has been accused. And you have, I'm trying to think of the guy who fled to Poland. It doesn't really matter. The point is that when we're talking about Pizzagate, the empirical reality or unreality, the factual basis of it is, Comet pizzas that actually have underground tunnels and whatever. That's not the important thing. The important thing is the mythological understanding, the significance, the symbolism of the sex act itself. I think what we have to understand is that when we're talking about powerful people, elites, engaging in these sex acts, they, and this is again a mythological perspective, we're sort of viewing these elites as gods. And we're saying that these gods engage in these sex acts in order to increase their power. Now, I draw a huge parallel between that modern mythology. Again, the factual basis, it could be true, could be false. I'm not talking about the factual basis. I'm talking about what does it mean? What is its meaning to us? What is the meaning of this mythology? And I'm saying that it's a very similar meaning to that of the ancient Greeks and Romans when they talked about Zeus being this character, this elite character who exercised dominance over other men. He exercised dominance over boys. That is a transfer of power. And you can call that evil, you can call it abusive, and I certainly believe that if you have a relationship between a man and another man, the man who is passive, the man who is subordinate, he's losing his masculinity. And so, in no sense am I advocating this practically. I'm not saying that people should engage in these kinds of relationships, because the passive partner will always be reduced in his masculinity. He's going to have his masculinity stolen from him, or he's either voluntarily giving it up or it's being taken from him. And that is, that can have disastrous results, right? Certainly, on its face, it seems to me to be abusive. You're removing an integral part of that man's personality. You're reducing him as a man. You're making him something less than a man, right? He's not a boy. He doesn't have the innocence of boyhood. He doesn't have the masculinity of manhood. He doesn't have the femininity of womanhood. And so he becomes this sort of hollow shell. And so there's clearly in Zeus, we see something very sadistic, right? And we see the power of sadism in Zeus. We see the power of sadism in the Pizzagate mythos. Again, I don't necessarily believe there was a guy named Zeus who is transforming into a swan and having sex with all these people. What I believe is that the Greco-Roman mythology tells us about how ancient peoples viewed sexuality. And the Pizzagate mythology, to me, is a pagan mythology. It tells us about how we understand sexuality. And that's important. Because the left wants to give us this exoteric mythology that sex is casual, sex is just sort of like a sport, or sex is like a hobby, or sex is like, having sex with a person is like eating delicious foods with that person. It's just a hedonic experience. It's just a pleasurable experience, and there's no negative consequences. This is clearly not the case. It's not the case when there's an age imbalance. It's not the case when there's a power imbalance. And so there really is something very sadistic about sexuality in general, whether we're talking about heterosexual sex, homosexual sex, sex with an age difference. There's something sadistic there. We have to recognize that. So if we want to protect our daughters and our sons, we're going to prevent them from having sex with, people where there's a power imbalance. And I would say, going along with the Tacitus's assessment of the Germans, I would say prevent them from having sex entirely and preserve that from them. The problem today is that pornography is prolific, and that we have to understand, if we're not looking simply at the exoteric sex act, because the exoteric sex act is biological. It's the man penetrates the woman, sperms released, ovulation, pregnancy, childbirth, and so on and so forth. So that is the exoteric biological aspect of sex. But the esoteric is representational. It's symbolic. And so then when we talk about pornography can actually be a more powerful sex act on a spiritual basis than the physical sex act. I mean, you could go out and have sex with a prostitute and give a few thrusts and then orgasm and then it's done. And you could walk away saying, that wasn't really that dramatic. It wasn't like some sacred, mind-blowing experience. It wasn't like I crossed some sort of threshold. Whereas with pornography, because of the esoteric symbology laden in pornographic films, in the different sex acts and so forth, you are actually able to, on a psychological level, on a spiritual level, I think, impact someone more than the physical sex act itself. So what I'm saying here is basically, if you want to create a warrior tribal people like the ancient German people, you would want to ban pornography, and something like prostitution you would view as less sinful than pornography. Because in prostitution, there you have the physical exoteric sex act, which is really much more mundane. It's really less powerful than the potential effect of something like pornography. So again, when we talk about this, it is in itself controversial, it is in itself uncomfortable, it is in itself a taboo to talk about these things because they're powerful. But if we want to understand how power operates in the world mythologically, we have to be able to talk about these things. And of course, what the left loves to do is anytime you criticize homosexuality, you must be a closeted homosexual. Anytime you analyze pedophilia, oh, you must be a secret pedophile. And so there's always this reversal. And so people, because of their pride and their fear of being attacked and socially murdered, because social ostracization in ancient Northern Europe meant you had to go out in the cold with no resources and no collective help, and therefore you're basically banished to death. And so people, especially Northern Europeans, are extremely afraid of social ostracization. They're afraid to question the status quo. They're afraid to question the power structure, because then the immediate response is, oh, you must be that thing which you're analyzing. If you talk about it, if you dare to uncover it, if you dare to discuss it, then you must be all the terrible things that you're talking about. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's talked about so little. But we have this pair, this Odin and Thor and Zeus and Hercules, or Heracles, and in both cases, you have two esoteric fathers who give birth, or who sire, two exoteric sons. So Thor, he's exoteric. He's just blatantly masculine. There's nothing really complicated about his psychology. There's nothing esoteric about him. He doesn't have a knowledge of the runes. He just has brute strength. He's not very clever. And he's just sort of out and about and doing as he does. On the other hand, his brother Loki is sort of a foil or opposite to himself, where Loki doesn't have the wisdom of Odin, but he's always conniving, he's always lying, he's always double-crossing. And so, in a way, Loki is the superficial esoteric. That Loki is... He's always lying, there's always something different. Whatever he says, it's always the opposite of what he says. He's a trickster. but it's cheap magical tricks, as opposed to Odin, who has a deep understanding of esoteric realities, who can see into the future and has all these mystical powers. So, you know, again, it's the difference between a magician and a warlock, or, you know, someone who can do a card trick versus someone who is a seer or a prophet or something like that. And then, again, we see this pairing with Zeus and Hercules, where Zeus has all this esoteric power, shape-shifting ability. He's king of the gods, just like Odin. But he has this son, Heracles, and Heracles gets his name because he's spurned by Hera. Hera is very angry. She's spiteful and vengeful. This is another great truth in Greco-Roman mythology, where Hera is really a terrible woman. And she's actually the queen of the gods, and she sort of personifies the power of women, what happens when you give women a lot of power, and Hera does have a lot of power. And so she is the opponent of Heracles, basically where he derives his name, basically hated by Hera. That's not an exact translation, but you see how the name is derived there, and then it becomes Hercules. But Heracles, again, he's someone who's blatantly exoterically masculine. He is forced by Hera to murder his family in a psychotic rage, not of his own volition, but he's driven into madness by her. And so then he goes on his labors, the labors of Heracles. And so he's just very exoteric. Again, he has feats of strength. He's not really using his cunning. He's not backstabbing people. He's not using esoteric knowledge. It's just a very straightforward action hero, superhero. So you have this, between Norse mythology and Mediterranean mythology, you have a very clear pairing between the esoteric father and the exoteric son. Now you switch to Judaism and you talk about Christianity and you talk about God the Father, God the Son. Here the roles seem to be reversed in many different ways, in that the father seems to be the exoteric guy. He's the one who works through the nation of Israel. When he's mad, he floods the earth when he's mad. A volcano erupts when he's mad. A hole opens in the ground and people are swallowed when he's mad. A bear comes and mauls people, right? So when he's mad, direct violence ensues. When he's happy, direct blessings ensue. And so God the Father seems, on a surface level, at least within the dynamic of Old Testament versus New Testament. Now, if you're a Jew, you might have a different interpretation. Something like God the Father being, or Yahweh, having this esoteric knowledge of how the world works and the universe works because he's this creator. And then you have Moses as the patriarch, sort of the son figure in that relationship. Remember, Moses is an orphan, so in a sense, God is his father. And Moses receives the Ten Commandments and he gives them to the people. And actually, Moses has a brother, Aaron, and he takes Aaron, and Aaron is actually the one who's speaking on behalf of Moses. So there's actually a threefold transmission there where Yahweh has the esoteric knowledge. He delivers it to Moses. Moses receives it, who then transmits it through Aaron to the masses of Israel. So there's actually several levels of mystery cult there in these persons representing each layer of esotericism. They're each carrying that sacred knowledge, watering it down, filtering it down, transmuting it, sublimating it into something that can then be understood by the masses. But in the Christian dynamic, Old Testament versus New Testament, you read the Old Testament and it's like, here's a list of genealogies, and here's a list of names, and here's a list of battles, and here's a list of places. It's very exoteric. Now, again, that's not necessarily how Jews read the Bible. In their commentary on the Bible, they employ esoteric readings, and they have the Kabbalah, and they have all this other oral tradition to add on to the written tradition that really makes all of this very dry stuff much more meaningful. But from the Christian perspective often has only inherited the Torah. They don't have the Kabbalah, they don't have the Talmud, and so from the Christian perspective, it's just like, okay, the Old Testament is very exoteric, it's very cut and dry, it makes sense, God has the people of Israel good, everyone else bad, but then the people of Israel fall, and then Christ comes along. Now, Christ is a very mysterious figure. He, to me, in his presentation, seems much more like an Odinic figure. He wanders around, he has 12 followers. He, his speaking is often cryptic, and in fact, it says in the Bible that basically I speak in parables so that really my true believers will understand me, but everyone else will be confused. And he does that purposefully, and that's an aspect of a mystery cult. Now, we can speculate, where does this originate? The Christ figure, is this something influenced by Greek and Hellenic mystery cults and Roman mystery cults, which were interacting with the Jewish world at the time? So there was all this religious transmission between the two Mediterranean cultures, or even three Mediterranean cultures, or even more than that if you want to talk about it. So you have the Essenes at the time who are doing their own mystical thing out in the desert. So you have all these currents swirling around. You have to ask, where exactly does this come from? But again, from the Christian perspective, there is a kind of inversion of the classical pagan structure where the Father is esoteric, the Son is exoteric. And that's sort of saying that the origin of things is in the esoteric, and then it's expressed, it's represented, it's transmitted to us, and it appears to be exoteric, but actually its father, its progenitor, is the esoteric. So the esoteric is foundational. Whereas in the Christian context, on the surface, my reading of the Bible, I look at it like the Christian tradition sets up more of a thing where we start with the exoteric. We start with something very simple and something very, especially if you go with like a Christian fundamentalist who says, yeah, the earth was created in exactly 6 days and so on and so forth. There was no evolution. And so then you go from an extreme exoteric text that's very dry and very instructional and very, here are the laws, here are the 617 laws you must follow. And then you go to the Christian context, says, you know what? You're a metaphorical branch of Israel. You're a spiritual branch of Israel. And the nation of Israel is like this concrete exoteric thing, but actually it's just a metaphor for the body of believers, which is this like spiritual concept. So again, in Christianity, the way that the Christian church has set things up, and I'm not saying that's necessarily how the Torah is, I'm not saying because they lose the Talmud, they lose the Kabbalah, but basically what I'm trying to say is that there's a setup there where the Old Testament, which is the book of God the Father, is exoteric, and the New Testament is esoteric, that Jesus is like cryptic and mysterious, and like the Greek and the Jew are all one, and the male and the female are all one, which is like an esoteric type of thing to say, where you're saying, actually these two things are dependent upon one another. I was just watching Trudeau Tom's, his latest Delusa, and he was talking about rhizomes, and he was talking about the predator-prey relation and how exoterically the predator and the prey appear to have nothing in common, but esoterically they actually have everything in common. They come from the same substance, the same ecology, their reliance upon one another. If one disappeared, if the cheetah disappeared, then the gazelle would lose its speed. So the cheetah is what has created the prey abilities of the gazelle, and likewise, if the gazelle disappeared and the cheetah just had free meats, then the cheetah would become slow, and it would lose that which makes it the substance of the cheetah, which is being the fastest animal, or the fastest mammal. So in losing its opposite, it would actually lose its own characteristics. So we can talk about that in terms of, there's an esoteric truth behind saying something like there is no man or woman, or there's no difference, or they're all one in Christ, that there is a unifying principle between men and women. If you remove women, then you actually lose the masculine element. Men are only masculine with respect to women. Without a female opposite to men, men have no ability to be masculine. So that's the incel, or the guy who plays video games in his basement. He's divorced from women, he's divorced from sexuality, and so he has no reason to adopt warrior virtues, and so he's androgynous. And similarly, a woman who is not trying to please men, who's not trying to have sex, who's not trying to pursue men, she has no reason to develop her feminine qualities, and she falls back into androgyny. So in the fact that they depend on one another, men and women really are, there is a unifying principle between them, and you could call that Logos, and you could then call that Christ, and therefore we understand the esoteric meaning of it. But again, you see kind of this transition. I mean, the Old Testament doesn't come out and say things like that. Like, by the way, did you know these two axiomatic opposites are actually one in Yahweh? It doesn't come out and say it like that. Like, there's no esoteric verse in the Old Testament that'll say something like, well, actually, in Yahweh, the Israelites and Canaanites are all just one. Whereas the New Testament does, talk about weird things like that. It talks about being innocent like doves and clever like snakes or serpents. So that shift there, again, is a reversal of the traditional pagan relationship where you see the esoteric as foundational and as ancient, and the exoteric as a resultant, as a descendant from its ancestor. Whereas, again, the Christian mythology totally swaps that and says, well, first you have an exoteric father. This is like the exoteric nature, the God, like Yahweh is envisioned as the god of weather, the god of volcanoes, the god of nature. He's this primordial titanic god, which actually Zeus has his own progenitor, his own forebears. Odin also has his own forebears in chaotic elemental nature, in like a materialism. And so even though I've described the pairing of the Father and the Son, there's still a background to that, which is the mythology of the Titan, the mythology of the giant, the mythology of that which came before the esoteric Father. So this is like grandfather materialism. And so Judaism seems to have that figure. Yahweh is a kind of primordial giant figure. He is a kind of titanic figure, someone who is one with the elements, someone where his anger produces disaster, his happiness produces blessings and bounty. It's a very materialistic thing. And then Christ is sort of a move from that exoteric, materialistic, titanic, gigantic mythology toward a new esoteric. But now the Son is esoteric. And again, this is further complicated by the fact that the Jews do have the Kabbalah, they do have the Talmud, and so they are able to look at the Old Testament and say, actually, even though we are monotheists, there are these different sephiroths, and there's different aspects to God. Like there's an eightfold aspect, and there's a feminine aspect to God, and the Shabbat queen, and they have all this other stuff there that actually adds on these mythological layers that seem to be missing from the Gentile reading of the Old Testament. So it's not to say that Judaism is necessarily the way that Christians interpret the Old Testament. But in the Christian understanding, it is like we have Father Titan and esoteric Son, as opposed to esoteric Father and actually Titanic Son. I mean, Hercules is a kind of titanic, gigantic figure, and the same thing with Thor. They are very elementally masculine. There's nothing really complicated about them, or there's nothing paradoxical about them, which is sort of the nature of mystical and esoteric things, is that they're sort of inherently paradoxical, that you have the union of opposites. So it's an interesting dynamic then, if Christ is this esoteric Son, then what would come after Christ? I mean, if we're looking at a traditional European mythology, okay, so you have an esoteric figure like Odin, Zeus, and then Christ. So then who would be the son of Christ? The son of Christ would then be a Thor-like figure, a Herculean figure. Now look at European world historical events and ask yourself, who is the son of Christ? Who is the exoteric version of the esoteric Christ? Who is the one who embodies masculine principles, who returns things to their titanic nature? Again, so you have the Titans who give birth to Zeus, Zeus who gives birth to Hercules. You have the giants who give birth to Odin, Odin who gives birth to Thor. And I shouldn't say give birth, I should say sire. But then you have Yahweh, who's in the Christian mythology titanic, not necessarily in Judaic perspective, but in the Christian perspective, he's titanic. And then you have the Son, Jesus. But then is there a possibility of him becoming a father and completing comparison between the Norse and the Mediterranean, then who would be the son of Christ in this example? I mean, it would have to be someone like Charlemagne, right? It would have to be someone who is not, well, I mean, the problem with Charlemagne is he's a king, and Hercules and Thor aren't necessarily kings. But it would have to be someone who's preoccupied with masculine activity and warfare and things of this nature. So, again, that's sort of up in the air. I don't know who would be the son of Christ in this situation. But, you know, I think someone like Charlemagne, maybe there's a better answer out there of who is this mythological, maybe Beowulf, perhaps, or I'm trying to think of other famous warriors in European mythology that could fit into this mold of being the son of Christ. That would be kind of a logical evolution of the myth, wouldn't it? From the Christian perspective. Now, from the Jewish perspective, maybe not so much, and maybe that's why they have a problem with Christ, is because they already have this complete mythology, and then Christ comes along and he's kind of lying about, you know, the nature of Judaism from the Jewish perspective. Now, there's all kinds of questions like, well, how did the Kabbalah evolve? How did the Talmud evolve? Were those things even complete at the time of Christ? So my contention is that when Christianity came along, there were a bunch of Jewish heretical sects. There were all kinds of, in the same way that when Christianity first came around, there were many different books, and no one knew which is the apocryphal book and which is the standard book, because the Council of Nicaea hadn't yet been called. And so there was a whole bunch of confusion. I think the same thing was happening among the Jews, where some Jews were saying something like, you know, reincarnation is real. I think that the Sadducees might have believed in reincarnation. But they didn't win out. Actually, the Pharisees won, and so they are not so big on reincarnation. But you had different views at the time, and so to retcon, there's a difference between looking at this historically and the historical progression of ideas and spiritual evolution versus the mythology as it presents itself in a completed form, mythologies as they present themselves, and then we look at them in parallel to other mythologies and we say, well, actually, this mythology could evolve further. I don't know. I mean, would Nietzsche be the son of Christ in a way? Nietzsche is this, he's this hyper-masculine individual. He's this fighter, and he talks about the European fighting internally rather than externally. There is a kind of relation there. But again, the way that Nietzsche approaches Christianity is very much in the same way that Zeus and Odin approach the Titans or the giants, in that they dismiss them as relics of the past, and something whose time has come to an end. So the relationship there is not one of a father-son relation. I guess to complete the mythos, every Christian, ideally, especially in the Protestant context or in the Catholic context, it would be the priests, they view themselves as sons of God and as sons of Christ. I guess Christensen is a name that owes itself to that perspective, being a son of Christ or being a servant or a slave of Christ. But the mythology is different there in that ultimately you're supposed to be the servant of God. You're supposed to serve alongside Christ, that Christ is the perfect servant. Whereas that's not really how, Hercules and Thor do have a degree of filial piety, but they are men in their own right. So I don't know. Another concept I wanted to explore, if I have time, is the concept of astrology and the concept of looking at the stars versus looking from the stars. So when we stand on Earth, we are situating ourselves within an ecology, and we look up at the stars, and the stars appear to be a multiplicity. Whereas if we imagine ourselves as a point among the stars, looking down on Earth, then we are part of the multiplicity, and we're looking down at this organic ecology. And there's kind of a split there between, are you a deductive reasoner or are you a inductive reasoner? Are you deducing or are you inducing? Are you taking a whole bunch of facts and empirical things out there, and are you then coalescing them into a theory, Or are you taking a theory and then trying to pick it apart and derive facts from it? You know, the scientific method, in a lot of ways, you're trying to look at a bunch of facts and then coalesce them into a theory. Whereas, you know, taking starting with your theory and then trying to derive facts from that would be something like a theory of like tea leaves or something. Like the tea leaves, if they are pointed north, then that means things are going to be good. Okay, well, how does that apply to this specific situation? Well, that means we're going to win the battle, right? So then you're taking the general theory of tea leaves, and then you're having some kind of result from that. And how does that relate to astrology? And how does that relate to our cosmology? Do we think the Earth is the center of the universe? Do we think it's the center of the solar system? Or is the sun the center of the solar system? So the way that, like, whereas the stars, I think intuitively we look at the stars and we recognize, aha, that is a multiplicity. We connect the abstract principle of multiplicity with the heavenly bodies. Whereas when we look at the Earth, and this is not something that classical people necessarily did, but if you look at the Earth and your perspective is, okay, we are the subjects out in the stars, or we're looking at the Earth as an object, that's a very different idea, right? That you're coming from the standpoint of the multiplicity, and then you're looking at the organic whole. So how those two relate together, I just wanted to introduce that idea, and maybe you guys have some thoughts on that. Other than that, I have little time left. So that's the end of the video. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.